Hey everybody, welcome back to Mr. Henry's Classroom where we're covering AP World History. Today we're going to move into a new topic. It's belief systems of the empire. So this is the last of the three topics that we cover for the land-based empires unit. So today we are going to talk about a little bit of the land-based empires, but mostly we're going to talk about stuff that's going to really relate to Unit 4, about the maritime empires, which particularly we're talking about England, France, Spain, and some of the other ones that will come up in later units. But we're talking about beliefs of empires today, and the essential questions that we're going to talk about or what we're going to cover, is to what extent did the Protestant Reformation change the Christian church? Number two, how did the Islamic schism influence the gunpowder empires of the early modern period? So, a little context here. I mean, the Christian church we've talked about in the past with Unit 0 especially, how it starts really during the Roman Empire, and it spreads through much of Europe and beyond. And we talked about moving to Africa and then parts of the Middle East as well. Even along the Silk Roads do we find Christian missionaries and so forth. That's something that could continue during a little bit of this time period. But regardless, what the majority of Christianity is found in the world at this time is in Europe. And in what was kind of parts of the empire, there is a great schism. Once the Western Roman Empire collapses, and the Eastern Roman Empire collapses, or continues, I should say, in the Byzantine Empire, there ends up being a schism between the beliefs of how the church should operate and other things. And so that leads to this, what we call the Great Schism, which is a split between the Roman Catholic Church, which would be led by the ruler of that would be the Pope, and then what happens with the Byzantine Empire with the Eastern Orthodox religion. And Orthodox and is going to continue on in Russia as well after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk real briefly about later today. So over time, there are new ideas and challenges to the Catholic Church, and that's kind of what ends up becoming what we know as the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation marked a break with existing Christian traditions, and both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations contributed to the growth of Christianity. So that's the first kind of key concept that we're going to cover today. And so it being read, this is something that's directly from the College Board. But we're going to talk about this in great detail. And so, yes, it's going to be a little long, but I want you guys to have plenty of information about how to approach this. If you get a question about the Protestant Reformation, there's a lot of context and information here. So if you need to fast forward at times while I'm rambling on, feel free to do so. But the Protestant Reformation, what it is, it's the Roman Catholic Church was essentially challenged by a lot of things during this later half of the Middle Ages and kind of approaching into what we call the Renaissance period. So there's a major shift from feudalism towards more centralized governments, and that's a huge deal because feudalism, really depended on the role of the church as political advisors and such. Even though that the church doesn't have control over those lands, and there's still these states and kingdoms that do control the land that are secular from the church still has a great deal of influence. But as the power of the states grow and grow, the church does not have as much influence. Oh, it still does. Trust me, it still has plenty, but it's starting to change a little bit as well. And the church is also becoming subject to discussion about some of the corruption that is going on within this large bureaucracy that is become the Roman Catholic Church. And so as time goes on, there's going to be people within the church that do challenge some of the notions and some of the practices that are being done by the Catholic Church, as whether or not this was the intention of Jesus and of the Bible itself. And so we'll talk about many examples of those challenges today. So the first ones that we're going to talk about had real theological differences or disagreements with the Catholic Church itself. So first one we're going to talk about is John Wycliffe. And so in the 14th century, he kind of argues this concept of the idea that maybe people don't need salvation or don't need the clergy, the priests, to help provide them with the path towards salvation. Maybe they can find it on their own, perhaps by just reading the Bible. And around the 14th century, it kind of is prior to where we see the printing press arise. When the printing press arrives, that idea is definitely going to accelerate because the Bible becomes more readily available to people to be able to read than it would in the previous eras. And where the ones who had the Bibles typically are the members of the clergy, the priests, the bishops, the cardinals, Pope. So that's something that comes about during this early time, and so that's kind of a slight challenge to it, but it doesn't lead to a full split or break off of the Catholic Church at that time. But the ideas will persist. The Hussites, they're followers of Jan Hus. They are going to be found in a region of what is now Germany called Bohemia. And so they were declared heretics by the Holy Roman Empire, which ruled over those lands, because they believed similar ideas to Wycliffe. The idea that you don't need the church to be able to help you find salvation. You need just yourself to be able to know the words of the Bible and to find it yourself. So that's, where you start to see, people are breaking off from this idea or such, then because they're being declared as heretics, that becomes them almost like enemies of the state. So the church is trying to squash this out, but it will continue to grow and grow and grow. Hudrich Zwingli, his teachings are going to be basically they should follow the exact teachings and the words of Scripture. And then they opposed some other practices with the church. One in particular was the idea of celibacy for clergy, where clergy couldn't take wives, and that they had to basically give up and live a life of celibacy, and focus primarily on the church itself and living the life of what a priest is expected to. And they opposed this idea. It's like, why shouldn't the priest be able to get married? Some other church issues, like the French were gaining like greater and greater like influence over the church. I think there's one more here that didn't make it in. Oops. And then also the church really failed to get the Black Plague under control, where a lot of people, they still don't understand the Black Plague and the what happened there and such, the Black Death itself. They don't understand the reasons for why it happens because of germs that were introduced by fleas that came through the trade routes the Mongols protect and so forth. They don't see it that way. There's more of we're being punished for our sins, and the Catholic Church tell them if they do these things and they'll be protected, and that didn't happen. So there is some pushback from the Catholic Church for the events that occur there. Okay. So probably one of the most important reformers during the Protestant Reformation is one Martin Luther. And Martin Luther was a monk that lived in Wittenberg, Germany. And so he's a Catholic monk. He's grown up in the church in a way. And so over his time, he starts to see some problems that he feels that need to be fixed and addressed or reformed. And so he protested that many of the church traditions were in direct violation of what the Bible teaches, how people should practice and so forth. And so he ends up nailing a list of these things that need to be fixed, things that should be addressed that the church is doing wrong. And it's called the 95 Theses. And so they are put up nailed to a church door. And this ends up being kind of a very big break or very big moment in history because of what it leads to. Now, I'm not going to talk about all 95 Theses. There are a couple that we could talk about. One in particular I want you to focus on, especially since you already have so much you're going to have to remember anyway, is the idea of indulgences. And so this was a practice that was done by the Catholic Church in which you give money to the church, then essentially all your sins would be absolved, rather than going through different means of trying to absolve your sins. When you think about it, the root of this is essentially that the wealthy can essentially buy their way into heaven. And where much of there's parts of the Bible where it talks about how being wealthy is not ideal in Catholicism and so forth, and Christianity. And so, that was something that Martin Luther definitely had issues with and took issues with. So he also advocates for the idea that's similar to previous, Reform ideas, about the idea of sola fide, Latin for faith alone, where you don't need the clergy as a basis for your guidance to salvation. You only need the Bible. And that, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press made the Bible more available. This is an idea that can stick more so. So he's encouraging people to read the Bible for themselves and find the words of the Bible as a guide to salvation itself. So in 1521, Martin Luther is excommunicated from the Catholic Church by Pope Leo X. And so there were going to be some people who do back him, Luther, and his ideas, and some of them would end up being leaders of these German states that exist within the Holy Roman Empire. And so that is something that comes into a play and is going to make a huge influence, so to say, on some of the things that will happen and events that will occur in the coming years after Martin Luther's time, right? So Martin Luther also had his ideas had some big social impacts on Europe as well. And it was partly, a lot of these were by promoting the idea of reading the Bible, it taught women how to direct access to God. And so more women end up becoming literate because of this idea of sola fide, to find salvation through your own reading. And that plays a role in the idea that women should be more educated, and that's something, of course, continues. Protestants generally didn't build covenants to or give women leadership positions, and so to an extent, women do play a more hands-on role in their faith. But still, like many of the churches for a long time, women can't become clergy. They don't take, leadership positions. There are some Protestant religions today that do that, but immediately that just doesn't happen. But over time, yes, it does. Another reformer, the Protestant Reformation, is John Calvin. And he's a French theologian. He is going to break off from the Catholic Church in 1530. And he ends up creating this kind of religious community where people who are like-minded gathered in the place of Geneva, Switzerland. So there are some ideas. Again, we're not going to go over them all, but there's a few of them I do want to talk about. One is the idea that he believed that there should be a theocratic order, that the church and the state should be one and the same, and that the leaders of the church should also be the leader of the state. Kind of a departure of what was going on in Europe after the Catholic and Orthodox split. One of the other ideas that he believed in was this idea of predestination, that God has already determined you. So at birth, you are determined whether you're not going to heaven or you're going to hell. And that is something that is a little different than what you would find in most of the religions of Christianity today, where salvation is something that can be attained. What he's really saying is that you've already been chosen, whether you're going one or the other. But despite that, you should still live by accordance of what God wants and how you should live. And so he promotes the ideas of simplicity, same to Luther, if not relying on a clergy, but also reading the Bible yourself. And then he also, they encourage the idea that you can get prosperity, especially on earth, through, obedience and hard work. So the harder you work, the more likely you'll have prosperity and wealth and security in your life. Calvin's followers were called the Huguenots. And there are different branches of them that do split from, and they take a lot of his ideas and they split from other churches as well. Some examples: Presbyterians were a Reformed church in Scotland that broke away from the Catholic Church and has kind of used a lot of John Calvin's ideas with some other ones to add. And then also the Puritans in England. And the Puritans, you probably know from history, from U.S. history, they're the ones who were the Pilgrims that sailed to Plymouth Rock and established Plymouth, the first colony, kind of in the northern colonies and stuff. They're called the Puritans, even though they don't really call themselves that, but they're called the Puritans in history because they wanted to purify the church. They wanted to purify the Church of England, because the Church of England is going to go through its own Reformation, where it's kind of taking and keeping some traditions of Catholicism, but also, some of the traditions or new ideas from Protestantism, and kind of creating this new church, something I'll deal with a little bit more on the next slide. But they wanted to kind of purify it and make it fully kind of Protestant, more the reflection of what John Calvin's ideas were. But they are branches of Calvinists themselves. So going back to England, and this is one of the ones that almost all my students really like to hear more about, because it's such a fascinating story of how they got to this whole new church, and it's called Anglicanism. More properly, people refer to it as the Church of England. So England, like most of Europe, was Catholic, and very devout Catholics. The church itself would, approve the rule of the kings and so forth, as did a lot of kingdoms inside Europe as well. But what ends up happening is that a king that will come down the road, his name is Henry VIII, and everyone's heard of Henry VIII. Everyone's heard of Henry VIII because of his wives, okay? And I will tell you the story of his wives, and each one of them, if you'd like, okay? I'm going to put it at the end of the lecture. And so bear with me. Hopefully some incentive for you to hang in there, because it is a long one today. I will tell you about the story of his wives, and it is a fascinating story. But bottom line, Henry VIII is wanting to divorce his first wife. And that is largely because she's unable to bear a son. And he wants to marry another woman, her name Anne Boleyn, and marry her so that she can hopefully bear him a son. And that's really, really important to Henry VIII, is to have a male heir. And so when he asked the Pope for this granting a divorce, the Pope, who is also kind of playing into the role of geopolitics here, he's afraid that if he does this, if he grants this, then there would be a conflict between Charles V, who is the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, and England. And the Pope did not want to see a war break out between two Catholic nations. And so as a result, he says no. And Henry VIII, who is also being fed information about these new ideas, part of the John Calvinists and others, Lutheranism, and he kind of makes the decision that I'm going to make my own church. And with the approval of the English Parliament, he establishes the Church of England and sets it up to where he is the head of it. And if you're in charge of the church, you can pretty much do whatever you want, like divorce your wife. So he does. And that's how Anglicanism kind of comes about. And they do keep a lot of traditions from Catholicism, but they also incorporate a lot of ideas, not necessarily all from John Calvin, but some from John Calvin, maybe a few from Lutheran, and they establish their own church. And Anglicanism is really important because many of the Protestant religions that exist, especially here in the United States, are branches off of Anglicanism. And that's how it starts. So, yeah. Okay, so as the Reformation kind of spreads, there's a lot of Protestant churches that break away over time from the Catholic Church and such. So you create an entirely new branch of the Christian church, and from that, it splits off to more and more. So we started with Protestantism here. You have things like Quakerism, Presbyterian Reform, Anabaptists, which were believe that baptism should be had later in life. Where Catholic traditions usually baptizes the child within a month of birth, and so they're saying you can't really choose to want to be a Christian in that early of an age. You must wait later. So that's something they did. But yeah, here's a lot of different little branches that come about as a result of this major split. Now, the Catholic Church isn't really happy about this, and there is going to be pushback. And so we'll start with kind of their own counter-reformation, right? So they are going to do some reforms to try to bring people back into the fold. And they're also going to do some other things that are going to be really end up being violent in some cases, or at least, on behalf of them, but this whole Counter-Reformation does happen, and to counterbalance the Protestant Reformation, and so they start to use an increase of inquisitions, and these are things that where they try to root out and punish people who are non-believers and such, and it's not uncommon for torture to be part of that to convince them that they should come back to the Catholic Church. But that's not really the top reason or thing that they do. I mean, it does happen, but other things that they do. One example is they do bring some reforms themselves, and one of them is in the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563. There's a lot of things that will be clarified as far as Catholic doctrine and some of the practices. So some of the reforms and changes in this Counter-Reformation end up happening was they corrected some of the abuses and corruption that the Protestants were protesting to begin with. The idea of indulgences, gone, right? And there's some other things that they do bring, but it's not all of them. They still won't allow clergy to marry. They do make an effort to try to reform some of the ideas that were put forth by Luther and others, but it just, the Protestant Reformation still will continue. They put more emphasis on education and supervision of priests, so giving more education opportunities to priests and being able to deal with answering questions and making themselves more valuable still, because now that everyone can own a Bible, not everyone can read it in a way that they feel the church intended to do and begin with. So, teaching them how to read the Bible, the stories and meanings, why they're important in daily lives, it makes it so that the clergy still holds a lot of value to people in society, especially when they're trying to find salvation. They also give more attention to the idea of individual spirituality and for piety, having a devotion to the church itself. From this whole Counter-Reformation, you all see some new religious orders, some examples of the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, and the Franciscans, something I'll talk about a little bit more in a couple of slides. But they're very committed to the renewal of the church and the expansion of the church, finding new converts, okay? Overall, the Counter-Reformation is generally successful, as it does, maintain that Western Europe, most of Western European states, despite the fact that both England and also the Netherlands and parts of the Holy Roman Empire do convert to Protestantism or a branch of Protestantism. But by and large, they increase their numbers, and so they send out missionaries, and many of them convert Native Americans and other places. So let's talk about those a little bit. But this is a little picture painting of the Council of Trent, and you can see it's mostly made up of clergy as they discuss the doctrine and clarifying the doctrine and making it essentially kind of giving it an update of what does the Catholic Church believe and stand for, and make some changes that hopefully would bring people, or at least not allow people to flirt with the idea of converting to a different branch of Christianity. So there's a lot of missionary work that goes on and part of this. And so the Spanish and the Portuguese especially, and these are going to be maritime empires, so we're going to talk about it in Unit 4. But they are going to, as they expand overseas, they are looking for more converts. And so they bring these missionaries with them, priests, monks, in order to try to convert the native populations of the places that they are exploring and colonizing. And they would set up missions. They would find ways to convert. And basically imperialism made Christianity globalized, and they are going to try to convert lots of groups of people and nations of people to Christianity. Some of it successful, some of it not. Most of these missionaries are Catholic. It's all part of that Counter-Reformation, right? And while the Protestant Reformation did promote the growth of it, they weren't as interested as Catholics were. So missionary orders like the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits come to fruition here, and they do find success in converting lots of these native populations to Catholicism. The most successful was Spanish America, which was pretty much all of Latin America, so South America, Central America, parts of the Caribbean, a lot of them were converted to Catholicism. And even today, if you go to those countries in South and Central America, they are largely Catholic nations. And there's going to be some blending of the local cultures with Catholicism, but most of them are Catholic countries today. They also find some success in the Philippines, which is a pretty Catholic country today. Example of that, if you ever seen Christmas in the Philippines, you think it's bad here when they start putting out stuff on the shelves before Halloween. Go to the Philippines, apparently, and it's way bigger deal in the Philippines than it is in most of America. So, but anyway, the Europeans, they do have some success there. They encouraged the belief that the old gods had been defeated and that the new God has arrived and kind of replaced them. But anyway, Christianity is a universalizing religion, and this was the Catholics trying to find more converts, so more souls to be part of the church. But over time, there's also going to be some religious wars because of this Protestant-Catholic split. And so the religious differences kind of spill into the geopolitical side of it as well. Charles V, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, which, he was a Catholic himself, he is going to fighting against rebellions in some states within his empire who are wanting to convert to Lutheranism. What ends up happening is you get something called the Peace of Augsburg. And that essentially allows German states to choose whether they want to be Lutheran or Catholic. And so once that happens, there is going to be kind of forced conversions, or essentially if the leader of that state wants to be Lutheran, then the people of that state must be Lutheran. And so there wasn't a toleration of either one. And this led to the people being forced to move from one state to another based off of, whether or not they supported Catholicism or Lutheranism. Charles V, after losing those religious wars and so forth, and failing to stop the spread of Lutheranism to begin with, he is pretty disappointed by that. The people, and so before he dies, he splits the Holy Roman Empire into Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and he turns over the control of the Holy Roman Empire to his son Ferdinand, but his son Philip II kind of gains control over Spain as a result. And Philip II plays a humongous role because he kind of saw himself as this great crusader himself, and he wanted to reunite Europe under Catholicism. And so he, with the enormous amount of money that he would end up having because of the gold and silver that they find in the Americas, he funds these military expeditions to the Protestant nations to occupy them and try to reconvert them back to Catholicism. He does send a military expedition and is able to take control of the Netherlands for about 17 years. But even then, his reconversion to Catholicism did not succeed. But his greatest kind of moment in history is when he is going to put a lot of money and resources into building this great armada, this great navy that he would use to try to invade England, which is an island nation. You would need a great navy to do so, and try to force the conversion of the people there back to Catholicism. And they had tried to, one of the successors of Henry VIII, his first daughter and eldest daughter, Mary I, she tries to bring Catholicism back to England and convert. And that's probably why she gets the nickname, you probably have heard of her, Bloody Mary. But she fails to do it. Her sister Elizabeth, who was a big supporter of the Protestant Reformation, continues to push the Protestant Reformation into England. And so this is what leads to the Spanish Armada. And the Spanish Armada, they sail to England. And there is some small battles, and the British are pretty clever in doing things like setting ships on fire and send them into this crowded ship group of ships and so forth. And that is somewhat successful. But really what happens is there's this gigantic storm that hits the channel, the English Channel, and ends up sinking a great deal of the ships. And so without the ability to continue, the Spanish Armada fails. And that's like the beginning of the end for the great Spanish Empire, because they put so much money and resources into this. That pretty much like it leads to where they are going to start to lose the balance of power in geopolitics, and countries like England and France are going to start to fill that void, especially England. There's other religious wars that go on. I mean, you see religious wars in France where, Catholics and Huguenots are going to fight. There's in 1572, there was a huge massacre of thousands of Huguenots. And so France is being pulled apart at this point over this split between Protestant and Catholics. And so as a result, Henry IV, who was the King of England at the time, he puts the Edicts of Nantes out there, basically allows religious toleration of Protestants. And so, he himself being a Catholic, he also kind of like can't allow his country to split apart and have these wars continue. So basically they allow, there's a toleration for the people who are practicing, Calvinism, essentially. The biggest one that you should know about as far as the religious war that results because of the Protestant and Catholic split would be the 30 Years' War. And this occurred from 1618 to 1648, 30 years. And so this basically fight starts within the Holy Roman Empire. Once again, we're starting to see this movement to try to reunite under Catholicism once again and bring some of these states that broke off and became Protestant, Lutherans especially, and they fight a war, and it continues and drags on. It brings in other nations. The Spain backs up the Catholic side, England backs up the Protestant side. It really was a very ugly war, and even a war is not always a great description of it. It's large-scale massacres that are occurring here. And so as a result of this, this war that does go on, about anywhere between 15 and 30% of Germany's population is killed or murdered in the course of this war. So it really kind of ends up being an important point in history, because what comes out of it is known as the Peace of Westphalia. It's essentially a peace treaty, and establishes that each state has the sovereignty that it can decide its own religious affairs. And while that kind of is important for this particular, it also establishes this concept that continues into world history today, where we have states, we have 100 and something odd states across the world. And this idea of sovereignty, that each state is allowed to have control over their own affairs within their borders. That idea, that concept is essentially established with the Peace of Westphalia. And that is something that, it's important to note as far as when we're talking about context of certain things in the future. But really, when we talk about modern world history and the events that shape modern world itself, you got to put this event in there as being one of the really important ones. The state system as it is today finds its roots in the Peace of Westphalia. There's also some reforms that go on in Russia, and because they're not part of the AP curriculum, I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but essentially Peter the Great is going to take a great deal of control over the affairs of the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's always been this relationship between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the czars. And so he basically abolishes the head of the church, known as the patriarchy, and kind of incorporates something new, which it's called the Holy Synod, which is essentially the collection of clergy, but they're led by a secular leader that reported primarily to the czar. And so this was in long-term short, it's the czars taking more of a hands-on control of the clergy and of the church itself. He also raised the minimum age of monks to 50, which was trying to get encouragement of more men to join his armies rather than to become part of the church. And a lot of his reforms are not very welcomed by the people, the peasants in particular. Thus, an example of something that will continue as the relationship between the czars and the peasants and how it can deteriorate over time. And so when we talk about Russia and the revolutions that come about later on, you got to mention that the relationship between the czars and the peasants wasn't always the best. All right, so that was the long part of the lecture. So we're going to shorten it up a little bit and finish up with a few more items. So the political rivalries between the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire intensified with the split within Islam between Sunni and Shiite. Something I already kind of talked about and mentioned before when we talked about conquests in 3.1. But the Ottoman Empire, so both of these empires are going to back a branch of Islam. This schism that occurs is over primarily the differences between who they believe to be the rightful leader of the empire of Islam. For the Sunnis, they believe the caliphs, the first four caliphs, were the rightfully guided individuals, particularly the uncle of Muhammad, a guy named Abu Bakr. And so to the Sunnis, I should say, they believe that he was the true heir to Muhammad. But if you're Shiite Muslim or Shiite Islam, part of Shiite Islam, you believe that Ali, his cousin, son-in-law, was the true successor of Muhammad, and that his teachings and what his idea for Islam should have been the ones that should have been followed to begin with. And so this ends up kind of creating this huge schism. And so even today, roughly 83% of the world's Islamic population, Muslim population, is Sunni, 16% are Shiite, and the other is like 1%, which is, the mystics. Why am I explaining? This is embarrassing. Somebody's going to tell me in the comments who I'm trying to remember. But these Islamic mystics, it's going to come to me at some point, I'm sure. But anyway, so there's going to be a series of wars that are fought between the Ottoman and the Safavid Empire because of this split. And even though Islamic law does prevent that Muslims should not kill each other over religion, there's also this idea that if there's a religious kind of transgression that is occurring, then it's okay by Sharia law to do that, I guess. And so both of them feel that they are the rightful, true path of Islam, and that both of them have transgressed against that. And so, especially when you have issues over borders and trade and so forth, it does lead to wars. But the root of them are this split. And so there's a lot of wars, a series of wars that do happen within this time period between the two. You do not need to know about any specific examples of them, but they largely are just linked to that Sunni and Shiite split. It's not the only thing, but it's like the underlying issue that kind of triggers the other issues that occur between these two empires. Okay. All right. Oh, great. Something from Ben Freeman. It's on the PowerPoint. You can look at this a little bit more if you want to sum it up. So if you decided not to do any of the PowerPoint or my lecture and such and just fast forward to this, we'll give you some idea of what's going on. So the last one of the topics for 3.3 is the Sikhism, a syncretic religion that does come about. It develops in South Asia in the context of interactions between Hindus and Islam. So this is going to happen primarily during the Mughal Empire. And remember, there was also a lot of interactions in previous eras between Muslims and Hindus. The relationship is, it differs, right? But during the rule of Emperor Akbar, who was extremely religious tolerant, there is a religion that becomes more and more popular during his rule, and it's known as Sikhism. Now, Sikhs are, if you're Sikh and I'm presenting this wrong, please tell me in the comments. But it is from the College Board perspective and the academic perspective, it is a syncretic belief system. It does combine ideas of both Islam and Hinduism, but it is in itself a unique belief system that to itself. Okay, but they're coming about during the rule of the Mughals in India, they are casting aside this idea of the caste distinction that you find from Hinduism. And they also claim that women and men are essentially equals. They do believe that there is one God, but there's a lot of Hindu traditions in there as well at the same time. And so this was primarily found in developed in the Punjab region, where there are a lot of interactions between Muslims and Hindus. They developed this holy book by the Guru Granth, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. I'm so sorry. But they also created a central shrine known as the Golden Temple of the Amritsar. Googled a picture of that, and I hope that's the right one. And so it looks like very nice, beautiful. But that is a kind of a holy site, a holy sacred site for the Sikhs today. They also mandated a distinctive dress for men, and so people who are Sikh, especially for men, they don't cut their beard, they don't cut their hair. They wrap it in this turban and everything, there's like religious reasonings behind that. But that, is what Sikhs, and kind of what makes Sikhs distinguished from other religions inside India as well. They also evolved into like a militant community, and when I say that, I don't want to make it sound like they're aggressively militant and so forth. A lot of it is in response to the hostility that they receive from Hindus and Muslims. And so a lot of this kind of militant idea is for protecting themselves as well. This kind of plays a role when we talk about later on when Britain arrives, because many, over time, Sikhs are the ones that they'll employ to be soldiers to help keep control over India as part of the British Empire. But yeah, Sikhism, a really important religion and a newer religion that comes about as a result of the interaction between Muslims and Hindus. So here you go. That's it. That is all of the 3.3. There are some things, religions that we didn't talk about. Doesn't mean they're not important, like Shintoism inside Japan, especially during the Tokugawa shogunate. A lot of continuations. Islam continues to play a huge influence on North Africa and the Middle East. Buddhism has a huge influence on East Asia. That's Orthodox continues despite the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. It still continues to play a huge role inside Russia. And then, of course, Catholicism will spread from Western Europe especially into the Philippines, as well as into South America. So that's really, in a nutshell, the whole belief systems and how they link to the empires themselves. So make sure you respond to your central questions. To what extent did the Protestant Reformation change the Christian church? And then how did the Islamic schism influence the gunpowder empires of the early modern period? Okay, so make sure you put your responses in Canvas. That's it, or is it? If you stuck around to hear about Henry VIII's wives, let's talk about it now. So some of you probably just fast forwarded to this point in the lecture after I'll talk about it later and such. And if that's what you did, please go back and listen to the rest of the stuff. This is not AP material. This is simply because it's fun and interesting to learn in history, and I hope that a lot of you took this class because you like learning about history. But let's talk about Henry VIII's wives, okay? So we'll start with Catherine Aragon. So Catherine Aragon was originally married to his brother. And his brother was supposed to be the heir of England, but he dies not long after they get married. And so Henry VIII's father, basically, what he saw with his son was essentially like, you are a political tool to help me create alliances with people that I need to be alliances with so I don't get into wars with. So he asks her to marry his brother's widow. And it was kind of an odd arrangement, but he actually genuinely loved her. They had a quote, a good marriage, according to most of the historical record. However, despite the fact that they had a good marriage and that they did get along fairly well after it, but he divorces her because he wants to be able to bear a son. And back in those days, they didn't understand the whole idea of biology and X and Y chromosomes as being his fault. Because in those days, it was the woman's fault, and that was the popular belief. Regardless, he does split from the Pope and does help create the Church of England just so he can divorce her. And so the person he ends up marrying next is a woman named Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was, one of his, I wouldn't say mistresses, potential mistress. Kings have mistresses. It's just how it is. But he was infatuated with her, and she refused to become his mistress and such. So he's like, well, if I'm just going to be with you, then I'm going to have to divorce my wife, right? So she has a big influence on kind of what ends up happening, right? So Henry splits from the Catholic Church so he can marry her. Once he establishes the Church of England, he marries her. And they do have a daughter, and she becomes known as Elizabeth I, or second. It's second, okay? She is going to play a humongous role as a monarch in England's history. Let me go back. Catherine and Henry also had a daughter. Her name was Mary, Mary I. And so Anne Boleyn, going back to her, sorry, I'm jumping around here. Anne Boleyn ends up being she has a daughter, and then she also has a couple of miscarriages. And so the whole kind of like, does he become concerned with the fact that she can't bear him a son and this is an excuse? I don't know. But the rumors start to fly around the court that she is being promiscuous and having affairs with all the men in the court, including her own brother. Now, by most historical standards and such, these rumors are they're just unfounded. Okay, it never happened as far as what the historical record text tells us. But was Henry looking for a reason to get out of that marriage? Possibly. But regardless of whether or not she did it, she is found guilty and she is beheaded for treason. So off with her head. The woman he marries next is a woman named Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour was a woman that Henry loved, and she was the wife who does finally bear him a child, Edward VI. Edward VI will eventually become king, but not for very long. He was a sickly child. And when his father dies, he becomes the king at a very young age. And between being sick and the stress of being the king of England, it led to an early death for him. Regardless, Jane Seymour ends up dying a couple weeks later because of the complications of the birth. And so he's single once again. He basically stays a bachelor for a couple years, and he eventually marries a woman. It was a strategic marriage, trying to get an alliance with kind of states in Germany. And he marries Anne of Cleves. Now, the funny story behind this is that he didn't know who to marry. He's like, I need to have a marriage with somebody that's like an important ally. We need to kind of have, an important, and this is how, geopolitics work in these days, right? Marriages help create alliances and peace between countries. If, you have your son that's, living with that king, right? So he goes through this, he just asks people to bring me portraits of all these potential suitors, right? And he goes through the portraits and is like, ooh, she's quite attractive based off the portrait, right? And so ends up choosing her. She comes to England for the wedding, and apparently the portrait wasn't very accurate of her looks. And sadly, she becomes known as the ugly wife. But she, and despite the fact that Henry wanted to try to call it off and not marry her, they end up going through it, but it's short-lived. She's only married to him for 6 months. She does end up divorcing him and lives in the convent in a very luxurious life, I guess, as the king's sister. But one of the handmaidens for Anne of Cleves was a woman named Catherine Howard. who at the time of marriage was said to be about 19 years old. But I've seen other sources that may have put her time as younger. At this point, that Henry is grossly overweight and grossly, overweight, and then he can't walk and such, and he's much, much, much her elder. He marries her because like she's very energetic, I guess, very fun, and the age difference probably, and the fact that he could not walk probably played a role in the fact that she did get caught having some affairs, including with one of his body men. And that probably is more documented as probably true. And so because of that, she's committed treason and off with her head. Then it's Catherine Parr. And Catherine Parr is like the fortunate one. She outlasts him. It's the third and final Catherine of Henry VIII's wives. She outlives him by a year. She dies about a year after he dies. And she was said to be one of the more influential, if not the most influential, of him as king. Most likely, or most queens, Anne Boleyn was pretty influential, but most queens don't involve themselves in state affairs. She did, and she even convinced him to make the daughters part of his line of succession again. So what ends up happening, and this all goes back to they're all the Tudors. These are part of that Tudor family that I talked about in previous lecture, right? Henry VIII dies. Edward becomes king. Edward dies not very long afterwards, okay? Then it leads to Mary I. Mary I, who was a very devout Catholic, just like her mother, Catherine of Aragon, she tries to bring the Catholic Church back to England, and the reason why she gets the moniker Bloody Mary is because they did it with some authority. But it doesn't work in the long run, and Elizabeth ends up replacing Mary. And Elizabeth was a Protestant, more like her father and mother, Anne Boleyn. And so she helps kind of essentially complete the Protestant Reformation in England. But anyway, that's the Tudors. That's Henry VIII and his wives. If you stuck around this long, good job, good for you. I appreciate the fact that you're enthused about history. But this is stuff that, it occurs. And it's like a soap opera. And sometimes history is like that way. But with that, this is it for topic 3.2. I hope to see you all later. Take care.